Alright, now that we've taken a look at how to create some objects inside of Maya and how to manipulate things on the object level, let's go ahead and take a look at how we manipulate things on the component level. So let's go ahead and take a look right up here, and we'll hover our cursor over this area to see that we can do selection by object type, and it gives us a hotkey of F8. Again, there's a little video there if you want to click on that and take a look at that. And over here is the component selection mode. And you can cycle between object and component by hitting F8. So if I got my object selected and if I tap F8, you can see how it's putting me into this component selection mode. And the components are made up of vertices, which are the little corner points, edges, which you can see here, and then faces, which would be the solid polygonal face that you got here, 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 and all the different 6 sides of a cube. So again, you can just tap F8 and you can go back and forth. That's one way of doing it. We can click up here and switch back and forth if you want. The other thing you can do is right click over your object and say go to object mode, or you can right click over it and you can see that you've got access to the vertex, you've got access to the edge, you've got access to the faces as well. So that's going to change things depending on how you're selecting. So let's take a look at just using the vertex. These are these simple points that are at the corners. So we can go ahead and click on that. And if you remember from our previous video, we looked at how we can manipulate these points with the move tool. So it's the same thing as how we worked with the object level, but now we can work on a vertex level. So we can actually take this point and move it forward and then move it up. And if we want to use one of these 2 planes to move it around like that, that's possible. So we can distort the object like that. So you can select one at a time, or you can add multiple selections to things. I'm just going to hold down Shift and then add those 2 together. And then now whenever I move these, I'm moving both of those points together, and I can start to manipulate the shape even more. If you click and drag, you'll get a manipulator that a marquee actually that'll go around those 2 different points. And so that's another way of selecting. So we can do this and move this forward like that. And if we want to add to this selection, I'm going to hold down Control and Shift and then click and drag with my left mouse another selection over that. And now I can move both of these together. So again, we can select individual ones and move that. We can hold down Shift and add to the selection like this. And we can do a marquee, and we can drag just anywhere with left mouse, and if we hold down Control and Shift, we can add to that current selection that we have, and then we can manipulate that and push these down. So you can see really quickly, even with a cube, we can start to get some more interesting shapes out of that thing, right? So this could be the start of something that you want to build out. And it is possible that we could grab, you know, this side down here and just pull those out like that. Okay, so there is moving vertices. Let's take a look at rotating verts. So I'm just going to drag a marquee along the top here, just left mouse drag over that. And then we'll put on rotate here. And remember, we can get to the hotkey, that's E for that. And then we could rotate these points down if we wanted, something like that. And then maybe we can grab all these points here and kind of manipulate it like that. So that's how we could do rotation. We could grab all the verts in the entire object and it would be like we're moving the object itself. So we can do that. And then we can also do scaling. So we can take all the verts, we could scale it out that way, and it's kind of the same thing as if we were doing the manipulation on the entire object because we have all the verts selected. But things start to change whenever you you know, you just have a few verts selected, and you can really kind of tweak out the shape quite a bit here. So you can get some really interesting things going on like that. And you can see how I'm taking these 2 points like that and using the manipulator on just one axis, and I can kind of taper this object at that point. So I'm just going to move that in a little bit. So that's kind of a cool and interesting shape. I'll just select all of these and tap W to put it on the move tool and just move this up over the top of the grid like that. So there's verts. So you can see how those work. Now we can right click on here and say edge, and when we grab an edge, it's basically like you've grabbed this vert and you're moving those things together all at one time. So we can grab one edge here. Here's something to note. You can see if you put your cursor over it, Maya highlights what you're about ready to select. It doesn't mean it's actually selected, so it just kind of gives you a preview of what you're going to select. So I click once and it's selected. Hold down Shift and I'm going to select the other one. So we can move these things together like that, and we could put it on the rotate tool. We could rotate using edges like that. You know, if you wanted to rotate something here on the middle, you're able to do that. And let's take a look at, we'll select this edge, and we'll look at scaling. So again, the same thing. We could scale this thing out like this. We're just using this one axis. And if I selected the front and the back edge, then I could scale this thing forward like this. And maybe I'll select this right here and move it down, and you can see how I'm starting to affect the shape now. Or I could drag it back up. Okay, so there's a lot of different possibilities of how you can move this thing. Last thing we'll take a look at is we'll right click on here and we will say face. Now when you grab a face, it's basically like you've grabbed this vert, this vert, this vert, this vert, or this edge, this edge. You're grabbing this whole entire surface right here. And now we can click and drag and move that whole thing around all at one time. Same thing for this back piece like this. We can move this thing around like that. And something else to note, let's go ahead and put it on our vert. So I'm going to right click on here and say vertex, or you can hit F9. So F9 is verts, F10 is edges, and F11 is faces. So F9, F10, 11, get used to working with those. F9 is going to be our verts. So I'm going to select these two vertices, and our grid is visible, right? So we can turn on and off our grid. And I'm going to temporarily turn on grid snapping. You could click that and turn it on to leave it on, but I just like to hold down X and it temporarily turns that on. And now I can push down in this one axis and make sure it's snapping to the grid here. So I'm going to hit the space bar and go out to this side view here and then zoom in. And you can see how I've snapped down to that, just holding down X. I'm snapping down here, and I can grab these verts here, hold down X, and then snap those down. And if I wanted this to be flush with this line up here, I could hold down X, and then hit snapping on that. Now I think there's an option that I have, yours might not be snapping exactly how mine is, so let's talk about this option real quick in the move tool. Double click on this. And there is this retain component spacing, and not a big fan of this option. I get why it's there. I think it's on by default, so you definitely want to turn that off. And it's basically saying this: if I've got this relationship between where these verts sit and these verts sit, I might want to use grid snapping, but I don't want everything to snap up to that line. I want to move this as a group, and I want to be able to snap to grid increments. So I can turn this on, and if I hold on X, I can snap, and you can see how it's going to snap to this next grid space, but it's keeping this spacing that's kind of going on this relationship. So retain component spacing. Like I said, I think that's a default option, and that's one option that I probably use the least. So I like to have that off, and once that's off, you can see now I've got a group selected, and if I hold down X and then move up in that one axis, it snaps everything to that grid position like this here. Okay, so definitely try that out and get used to the way that that thing moves like that. I'm going to tap the space bar, go to the top view again real quick, and we're going to tap 4 on the numeric keyboard. And you can see it's going to put us in a wireframe mode. So 4 is wireframe, 5 is shaded, 6 is textured, which we don't have any textures, and 7 is lighting. Since we don't have any lighting in here currently, it's going to make everything black. So there's some more hotkeys that you're going to really need to kind of get used to. So remember, QWR is going to do your movement stuff over here, and then we just looked at F9, F10, and F11 for doing selection, and F8 as well from going object mode to component mode. And then we've got basically 4, 5, and 6 and 7 that will quickly put you in these different modes. So the reason I want to be in wireframe mode is because now I can see through the object and I can see the grid. So I can actually take these points and just hold down X temporarily like we did before and snap them at very specific places on the grid. So you can see I'm snapping that there and there, and I'll take these points, move them back, I'll snap this to this grid point here and here like that, and then I'll go spacebar, go back to the perspective view, and now you can see we're being very, very specific about where we're laying out certain points and things like that. Okay, so that's how you can use the grid to your advantage. You know, if it's not necessary, then you don't have to worry about snapping, but if you've got to be very specific about where something lines up and then having something else line up to that, you'll definitely want to use some of these snapping options. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk to you guys about in this section is if we hit F8 and if we look at the object mode again, or we can right click and say object mode and select this, if we rotate this with this right here, we're going to rotate it at an angle, okay, and if we put it back on the move tool, there's a way that we can move it along this new orientation that we've got. So if we double click on the move tool, if you scroll up to the top here, currently we're moving in world space, which is just aligned to the world kind of grid that you see here, and that's how we've been working. If we put it on this object mode, we can actually move the object. You can see how that manipulator changed to the new orientation of the rotation that we set on our object. So we can push this thing forward as if it's kind of like a spaceship that's kind of flying through the air. And if we rotate it back down and put it on the move tool, now we can move it down here at this angle, or if we rotate it here, hit W, we can move it forward or move it up, move it left or right. So that's just a different way of being able to manipulate the object, and that might come in quite handy for you sometimes. So I'm going to set all this stuff back to 0. So remember, if we go to the channel box, click here, hold down shift and click, and then type in 0, we got our object right back into the center here. Okay. One last little tidbit about this kind of movement thing. I'm going to open up the outliner. I'm going to go Window, Outliner. I'm going to show you basically how we could make a copy of this thing and rotate it about a certain point. So let's say we want this thing pushed out over here like this, and we want to make copies going around in a circle. We've got this orientation that we've got where it sits, and if we hit Control G, that will make a group. And we can give it a name. You can call this wedge 01, like that. And now if we duplicate it, so we'll go to Edit, Duplicate, and we can do Edit Duplicate Special because we want to do some stuff with this thing, and go to the option box for it. We're just going to make a copy right now, and we're going to give it a rotation of 30 degrees on the Y, because this is representing X, Y, and Z for translation, rotation, and scale. So since I've got this group, this empty group that you can't see, is just called a null object, and this thing is parented to it, whatever I do to that null object, if I rotate it, it rotates that object about that pivot point that we've got, like that. And I could rotate it like this. So if we make duplicates of this and rotate them at the same time, you can see we get a copy like this. So I don't like the spacing of that. Let's change that to 60, like that. Hit apply. Just keep hitting apply like that, and you can see we've got multiple copies of everything. And if you look at each one of these objects, if you select it, it's going to have that same translation and rotation and scale as like that original object. That's because all this new translation and rotation information is being held on these null objects. So we could, if we wanted to just kind of use that as a tool to get the spacing, we can select everything and we can unparent it from these groups, so we can take all this stuff out. You could take them out by hand. You could middle mouse drag them out. That's one way of doing it. But the easier way is just select everything and then to come up here to the edit menu and then go unparent, and you can see the hotkey for that is Shift P. So if we do that, now we've got these empty groups that we don't need anymore. You can just select them and hit delete or backspace to get rid of them. But now let's take a look at the objects as we select them. See how they all have rotation and translation values stored on them? So we've actually kind of transferred that motion that we did on that empty group, and now it's been pushed to the actual objects themselves. So again, you could always reset all this stuff. You could select all the objects and then go set all this stuff to 0, and you can see they're right back there in the center. But that's just a little quick thing about duplication and movement, and I wanted to tell you about that because we looked at how we can move things in the world, or we can do it by object, and it is possible to move things by something that is parented to something else, so you can get translation and rotation values from that thing. So I think that's going to be enough for you guys to get started right now and try to play around with some of these ideas. We did look at creating a polygon primitive for a cube, and you can see we can create that. If you remember in the earlier video, we just set up with the option box on there. We went create polygon primitives cube, and we set some of those options there. You really need to go through and check out some of the other primitives that they have. So they've got a polysphere primitive, and you can rotate that thing up. Just rotate that 90 degrees like that. And again, they've got these different options in here where we can change some of the values on this stuff and see about changing the way that these things are actually created. And that's because these are primitives. Try that out. Try out a cylinder as well, and then check out some of the different options that you have for the creation of a cylinder. And once you get done with the cylinder, you want to try out this cone shape. We've got a polyplane like that, and then we've also got a torus, which is very cool, and you can try out some of the options for this thing like this. You can change the amount of divisions on this thing and drop it down to get a nice ring twist, and you're able to twist that thing out too as well, which is pretty cool. And looks like we also have a pyramid type shape, which you could change the scale of this and number of sides. So let's see if I can change this. Oh, this is a drop down, so we can do 5 there like that. And we've also have a pipe or kind of tubing, which we could select this. You can change the radius with that, height, thickness. So there's a lot to play around with, and definitely get used to these primitives and how to create them and how to manipulate them. And that's going to be your first step in Maya, is really like you really need to get comfortable with moving around in the space, creating some objects, and manipulating them on an object level and a component level as well.